දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජ නාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
පවතින සමාජ දේශපාලන ආර්ථික අර්බුද හමුවේ අපි කොහොමද ඉස්සරහට යන්න ඕන?
මගේ මතය තමයි ලංකාවට අයිති භූමි ප්‍රමාණයක් විදේශීය සමාගමකට දෙනවා කියන එක. ඒක වැරද්දක් නෙමෙයි. හැබැයි විදේශීය රටකට දෙනවා කියන එක ගැටලුවක්.
රජයට අයිතිකාරයෙක් නැහැ. එයා ගන්න අවුරුදු 5 තුල එයා කරන ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් වලට ගන්න ලෝන් වලට එයා වගකිය යුතු නැහැ. එතනින් පස්සේ එන කෙනා තමයි වග කියන්නේ. අන්න එතනින් හැදෙන්නේ.
ඔබතුමා දැක්ක රටේ දැවෙනම ප්‍රශ්නේ මොකක්ද අපිට තියෙන්නේ?
අපිට දැන්ට පේනවා පෝර ප්‍රශ්නය පේනවා, කෝවිඩ් ප්‍රශ්නය පේනවා, ඩොලර් ප්‍රශ්නය පේනවා, තෙල් අර්බුදයක් පේනවා. මේවා තමයි දැන් අපිට පෙනෙන ප්‍රශ්න.
ඇයි එහෙම දේවල් කරන්න උත්සාහ ගන්න?
අපිට හොඳ විදුලි ජනනයක් සුනම් බලය මගින් කරන්න පුළුවන්. අතක මේ තාක්ෂණය ලෝකයේ විශාල විදිහට මේකේ පිරිවැය අඩු වී කියනවා.
මගේ වගකීමක් තියෙනවා මේ පුටුවේ ඉන්නකම් එක මිනිස්සෙක් හරි මේකෙන් බේරගන්න. ඒක තමයි මගේ දැක්.
ජනතාව තමයි අවස්ථාව දීලා
තියෙන්නේ. පැහැදිලිවම. ඒකට බලපාන අර ඔය අනික් කිව්ව දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතියක් නැතිකම තියෙනවා. ඒක අවසංස්කෘතියක්. සහ දේශපාලන සාක්ෂරතාවයක් නැතිකම.
මේ රටේ මිනිස්සු තෝරපු 225ක් මේ ඉන්නේ. ඒ කියන්නේ මේ අපේ හැඟීම් 225ක් තමයි මෙතන තියෙන්නේ. දැන් අපි හැඟීම් වෙනස් කරගමු. මේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට මීට වඩා හොඳ අය යවමු.
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not seconding to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID. This will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics. Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
අපිට උනේ ගෞරවනීයත්වය නැතිවීමද? එහෙම නැත්නම් අපිට බැරි හින්දා තවත් කෙනෙක් අපිව පාලනය කරනවා.
ඇල්ජීරියාවෙන් ප්‍රංශකාරයෝ ගියාට වැඩක් නැහැ කියන්නේ. මොකද හේතුව? ප්‍රංශ සංස්කෘතිය, ප්‍රංශ දේශපාලනය තනිකරම තියෙන කියලානේ ඇල්ජීරියාවේ තියෙන්නේ. අපිටත් උනේ ඒකම.
දැන් මේ ලෝක බෙදලා ඉවර දෙකට. ඒ දෙකට කියන්නේ මේ යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවත් එක්ක තමයි බෙදලා තියෙන්නේ. යුක්‍රේනය ආක්‍රමණය කරා.
අද ඔය නැවතත් කියනවා මේක යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවද ප්‍රශ්න නෙමෙයි.
ඒක තමයි ප්‍රශ්නේ පේන්නේ. ප්‍රශ්නේ ස්වරූපය එකයි. ප්‍රශ්නේ මූලයන් තියෙන වෙන තැන.
සම්පත් තියෙනවා. අපිට ඉස්සරහට
යන්න බෑ. හරියට හරි. ජාත්‍යන්තර වෙළඳපොළ ටාගට් කරනවා නම් එතන තියෙන්නේ gain of trade. භාණ්ඩයක් හරි සයවාවක් හරි විකුණලා ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් වාසිය ඉහළ වෙන්න ඕන.
මම ඉතින් දේශපාලනඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි ආර්ථික විද්‍යාඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි.
මේ දේශපාලනඥයෝ හොඳින් දන්නවා.
දේශපාලනඥයෝ
වැඩ කරේ කොහොමද කියලා.
හුඟක් හොඳට දන්නවා. ජනාධිපතිවරු 7 දිනත් එක්කම වැඩ කරපු එකම මිනිස්සයා මම හිතන්නේ රාජ්‍යස්ත්‍රී හිටපු.
විහිදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Kidney diseases have plagued villages of Madukare for many years. For 335 families that once relied on impure water, there's some hope. A water purification project by Gammadda. Gammadda, for the people, by the people.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
A very good evening and welcome. This is Newsline on TV1 for the Newsfirst team. I am Jama Ratnayaka joining you tonight. Today is the 21st of July 2022 and today we will be in conversation with Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Senior Lecturer and Head Department of Strategic Studies, Kothalawala Defence University. A very good evening to you, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Jamal. Thanks for having me.
Doctor, unfortunately, I am unable to have you here with me physically owing to the current situation in the country, but I am sure that we will have a very fruitful discussion that will lighten up our viewers as well as enlighten me in terms of what the global outlook would look like for Sri Lanka following the historic day we witnessed yesterday, Doctor. Let me just get right into the program and ask you, there was a change in administration yesterday. Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed the 8th Executive President of Sri Lanka. He took oaths as the 8th Executive President earlier today. A new government, a new cabinet will be appointed, a new Prime Minister will be appointed. Doctor, how will the international community view this?
Well, I think the international community, now the international community is not a monolith, but predominantly if you look at it from a perspective of, say, democratic governance, I think most of all of them I don't think would have any issues, because what you saw was a clear transition through a parliamentary process of appointing an interim president to fill in the time since the departure of the former president. So, and it happened through a parliamentary process, the democratic internal election. So I think that is what you saw from the US and India. If you saw the Indian spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs, I think that sentiment carries, because the transition was through a democratic institutional process. So I think the international community would not have an issue with the way the transition took place, because it didn't come through kind of a coup, a bloodshed. I mean, there was all these theories flying around. So at the end, it became that particular transition. So I think that's a positive out of so many bleak situations of the bleak situation we are in currently now. But that's for me a positive.
So, Doctor, let's talk about Sri Lanka's reputation on a global perspective. People like Lee Kuan Yew wanted to shape their own countries in the light of Sri Lanka. They wanted to make their countries a mini Sri Lanka. But in the recent past, we saw just yesterday India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar saying that Sri Lanka is an example of how not to govern a country, in other words, because he said fiscal prudence, governance, things like that were not up to par in Sri Lanka. How does Sri Lanka go about, or how does the President and his cabinet, including the Prime Minister, go about replenishing our reputation, fixing our reputation on a global scale, Doctor?
I think the problem with the idea of reputation is perception. I think Sri Lanka also, came out of a 30 years conflict, right? Which many countries, if they were in the same situation, would have not achieved, even in the West. And you can see now what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and what happened in Balkans, what has happened, in global conflicts. Countries have been in dire situations. So Sri Lanka was never an Afghanistan. So I think there are achievements. Then Sri Lanka, coming out of that, went into, in certain cases, we had democratic transitions, especially in the 2015 election of the good governance, as well as the fact that the Sri Lankan, there was in a way, a spring of protests in Sri Lanka, which managed to oust a very powerful president with almost zero bloodshed. So yes, Sri Lanka did have its challenges, but to take Sri Lanka as a model of negativity, I don't think so. But at the same time, we can't vindicate ourselves. There has been so much of mistakes. There has been efforts of certain tendencies to be authoritarian at sometimes to overlook democratic governance processes. So we have our leadership, our policymakers have made those mistakes. We have come through bloodshed significantly in the late 80s with the uprisings, the left-wing uprisings. So I think Sri Lanka did have its fair share of failures as well. But I think what we should look at is, apart from trying to fix our image, image fixing can take a little bit of time. When the image is tarnished, or globally when images are not doing well, I think we have to first look at the core issues. The core issues at the moment for Sri Lanka is dealing with the absolute necessities of the coming out of the economic crisis, the financial crisis, preventing the slide, getting back on, stabilization. So, and then only thinking of how we can look at progress. So we have some fundamental challenges there, and at the same time, we have to understand we have to stabilize not just economically, but we have to stabilize politically. So whatever transpired yesterday probably is a short-term fix, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. So I think Sri Lanka may have to go for a democratic process, maybe an election, but that might take time. So rather than, I think, worrying about how the world sees us, perceptions can be fixed, perceptions can be achieved. But I think where we are now is a situation, far beyond, fixing our perceptions, but more focusing on our core fundamental challenges, which is economic, political stability, and providing an overall form of human security. Which what I mean there is food security, right? Economic security, livelihoods. So these are the challenges we have, and with that, we also might have to think of our national security, because when the country is vulnerable at the way we are, and living in a geopolitically highly contested environment at the moment, we have to be very careful. So I think, of course, the international image matters, but if we fix the fundamental core issues, the image might get a little bit better. So I think we have to focus for the first time, we have to focus inward, and then, that might fix the external perceptions as well.
So, Doctor, like you said, let's talk about the core issues Sri Lanka is facing. We are facing the most severe economic crisis in our history. We do not have the reserves to buy fuel, medicine, food. How will President Ranil Wickremesinghe's image within the international community help us to bridge this, to help us to come out of this crisis, at least in the short term, while an IMF bailout program is discussed?
Yeah, I think the thing is this: the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, has always been projected as a pro-Western personality, and he's been projected as being able to sway the West. But I think this is the first time he's actually in the driving seat. So it's a test for the country as well as the new president, because the president now has to go beyond the perception of who he is, and now he has to deliver on that. At the same time, I think the fact that, of course, he probably understands global trends better, and of course he has those deep connections with the liberal world, the Western world. But I think the identity of Ranil Wickremesinghe has been shaped in a system that was about, a system that has changed. That's a bygone system. But the system that we have arrived now is a little bit different. So the system now is that globally there is no real center of power. Of course, the West is the Western preponderance is still there, but there is a serious alternative. There are alternative powers on the rise. So the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration cannot ignore the Belt and Road. It cannot ignore China's interests. At the same time, it cannot ignore how India has become a regional, and I mean it's on the pathway to becoming a very powerful country. India has one of the fastest growing economies. It has one of the fastest growing militaries, and its interest in projecting its strategic posture is enlarging. So we are facing a very, very potent, very powerful, very influential India than before. At the same time, we are facing a situation where China is also very ambitious about shaping global outcomes. And at the same time, where the status quo power, which is the United States, is very keen in maintaining that and also very keen in containing China. So these are the realities President Wickremesinghe has to deal with, and that situation probably begs the question. If he was known for being a pro-Western person, of course he has to maintain those Western links because the IMF, the bailouts, they're pretty much led by the Western order. So, which means he has to have a great relationship with India, with the United States, the international institutions, and of course he has a traditional friendship. It goes back with Japan. Japan is a key country here, but the Japan we are talking about now is not the Japan that was there 20 years ago. Japan is a very much ambitious strategic player. It has shed all that kind of peaceful coexistence. It's very concerned about China's rise. Even very recently, the Japanese Prime Minister has clearly said, they are living. Japan is facing one of the most highest levels of national security challenges because of the changes in the external environment. So Japan is very conscious about the global environment. So we have to understand the countries we deal with now, what their strategic interests are. So it's not the same Japan that used to support us about 30 years ago. It's a different Japan. So we have to understand their strategic compulsions. We have to understand how India has changed, and then we have to understand how the US and EU will want to engage with this part of the world, because suddenly it's not Sri Lanka, it's the region that we live in that has become very important. Through that importance, that is why the United States is having an Indo-Pacific strategy, EU is having an Indo-Pacific strategy, India is talking about the Indian Ocean Rim, Japan has an Indo-Pacific strategy, and then the Chinese have a Belt and Road Initiative. So we have to understand this particular reality in dealing with the world. So I think even for a seasoned person such as Ranil Wickremesinghe, who actually was very conscious about the geopolitics of the region, because under his stewardship when he was Prime Minister in the previous administration of the Yahapalana, he actually charted the way to create the shared vision of prosperity of the Indian Ocean. The only standing document we have on foreign policy to do with the new shaping of the Indian Ocean. So he's quite aware of it, and he probably have to play his cards well, because he just can't be that person who used to be known as a pro-Western. So he has to engage with the rest of the world. And of course, he could use the deeper ties he has with the Western liberal countries, and he just can't ignore the reality of China.
Professor Vidanage, we have a question from one of our viewers. He is asking about the interests concerning Japan. We know that Japan has been a long time friend of Sri Lanka. It has supported Sri Lanka through tough times. And as soon as former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came in to power in 2019, the LRT project was scrapped. That was given to Sri Lanka, or that was to be constructed in Sri Lanka at a very low interest rate. However, do you believe that this scrapping disheartened Japan to a certain extent, because Japan seemed to adopt a very passive stance when it came to supporting Sri Lanka. It wanted an IMF program in place before it started to support Sri Lanka, unlike countries like China and India that gave us credit lines, especially India that gave us credit lines worth 500 million multiple times. What is your stance on that, Doctor?
I think we have to make a little bit of hard work in working with Japan. One of the things, if you know, working with the Japanese, I mean, they're very generous, they're very, they're very focused, they're very committed. But if they felt a little bit betrayed, that goes a long way. That's cultural, partly, and they really want some kind of a redemption. They will not be easily swayed again. So it'll take some hard work. I think, fortunately for Sri Lanka, I think the Ranil Wickremesinghe's ties with Japan, I think, and the fact that he represents a political legacy which always had one of the best relations with Japan in Sri Lanka's modern history, might help us to overcome that. So I think that is why it's a positive when it comes to the new president and Japan, because Japan will be a key player in Sri Lanka's progress, because it's a country which has understood Sri Lanka, it has always been close to Sri Lanka. Even during the conflict times, the role played by Asushi Akashi, even when we were in trouble in certain international, like the Human Rights Council, Japan had played a critical role. So I think something that most foreign policy pundits in Sri Lanka miss is trying to understand the role Japan plays, and also how Japan's strategic interests have changed, right? So it's something we used to get grants from them. Now it's ODA, which is a strategic thing that they do to achieve their strategic objectives as well. And their ties with India is also crucial. India and Japan has one of the highest levels of diplomatic relations. They're so closer because I think one factor is China, and the other thing is Japan and India also had historic ties. So I think we have to understand that dimension as well in our foreign policy as well as our foreign relations.
So, as you know, President Ranil Wickremesinghe is former President J.R. Jayawardena's nephew, Doctor, and we all know the historic relationship between former President J.R. Jayawardena, the late J.R. Jayawardena, and Japan. Do you think this will play a role in Japan coming forward to support Sri Lanka more in the future?
I hope so. I hope that because Japan, but the thing is this, I think the fact that it's not just Japan, we have to work with other countries. I think the United States is key. India remains the fundamental pivot here because I think, after a long, Sri Lanka and Indo-Sri Lanka relations have always had its ups and downs. But I think India will now be that particular pivot state that we can never, we really have to rely a lot on. It's giving us a sense of it's the unscrutable hard power that we really need to be backed by. Of course, then Japan comes in. I think the Japan's long arm of development assistance, as well as Japan's diplomatic role in facilitating support from other countries. Japan plays a vital role in the Western Bloc. So I think that is important. Not just the fact that Japan is to give us aid or grants, but also how the Japanese role in convincing other countries to support Sri Lanka. That is very important. Sometimes we forget that. When we say support from other countries, we always look at it from a financial, economic. It's not just that. Providing us with the much needed diplomatic maneuverability, clearing the space for a small state like Sri Lanka to operate in that cluttered space. Because we have to understand, that we are living at a time globally, a global recession is around the corner. Global food crisis has already hit us. The estimates over 300 million people are already suffering from food insecurity. That may go up because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict looks like it's protecting and it's dragging a lot of European powers into it. And it's going to create greater instability in Europe and Eurasia and also the US. So that will all have a greater impact on Sri Lanka and how countries actually can help us. So we have to actually we have to act fast. So that is why I think Sri Lanka's political stability in the next 6 months matters more than ever. That's something we have to understand. The world is heading into a major instability. There is a global crisis that is about to erupt in the next few months globally. If we now it's like we are trying to run past it. So the only way we can do it to weather that crisis is to make sure we have achieved stability. This is why I tell people when they complain about this transition, the world and us are both left with making the best out of the most unappealing options we have. But we have to make that choice. If not, what's going to hit us in the next 6 months? Things will be very different from today to December. Just like that. So we have to be, that's why we have to be very, we have to be really conscious about it. And as policymakers, that is why I think the Ranil Wickremesinghe probably is facing the biggest challenge in his political career now.
So, Dr. Vidanage, I have another question from one of our viewers. Let me read out the question to you. Our immediate problem is fuel shortage. Why do you ignore the fuel-producing Middle Eastern countries? This is certainly a very intriguing question, Doctor. What is your stance?
No, I don't think we are ignoring at all. But I think one of the things that people have overlooked is the fact that most of the fuel-producing countries in the Middle East are being looked at as alternatives by the European powers. Most European countries are now, the reason why Sri Lanka is struggling to gain Middle Eastern oil is the fact that there's a major demand increase in the Middle Eastern markets from the Middle East producers, because most of the natural gas and oil that was procured through the Russians, that has died down.
Right.
Because of self-imposed sanctions, most of the Western countries are focusing on the Middle East.
Okay.
So that is a major challenge for us. So that is why there was a counter argument in Sri Lanka saying, when of course if these guys are looking for alternatives in the Middle East and the Middle East countries are jacking the prices up, why can't we go to the Russians? Because it's the Russian oil that has been rejected because of sanctions and because of political decisions the West has taken on because of their stances on Russia. So I don't think we have ignored the Middle East. I think it's just a fact the Middle East is being sought after. There is a huge spike in orders on Middle Eastern countries where all these European countries still have the cash to pay. And we have to make orders telling these guys, please give us this on credit.
Right. Thank you, Doctor. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for Newsline tonight. Tonight, we were joined by Dr. Harinda Vidanage. He is a senior lecturer and also the head at the Department of Strategic Studies at the Kotalavala Defence University. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining me tonight and enlightening me as well as our viewers on the global perspective when it comes to the regime change in Sri Lanka and how global players will act a part in Sri Lanka achieving sustainable economic stability. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all the time we have for Newsline tonight. Take care and good night.